Well, thank you all for joining us here today for another episode of The Art of Feminine Negotiation. We never take for granted that your time is valuable and appreciate always when you choose to spend it here with us. And today you're going to be really glad you did. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Today we're going to be chatting with Dr. Beverley Brewer about negotiating past suicide and the power of sharing your story. So welcome, Bev. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. This is I think we're going to have a good time.
Yeah, I can't wait for the conversation. I know we share a lot of similar philosophies about some of this stuff. And for those of you who don't know, so before I forget, Beverly earned her BA, her MA, her PhD from the University of Toronto. She's taught at Seneca College, Brock University, affiliated with OISE. For those who don't know, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She's got a long, very credited history in education. And in her doctoral thesis, one of the things that really struck me is that Bev defended the significance of navigating relationship and community in the learning experience, which was a really unique perspective to take. And I thought it was so apropos as Bev's latest book, which is gorgeous, by the way. It's a memoir called Dance into the Light, and it recounts Bev's personal story about dealing with the suicide of her sister. So I thought it was very appropriate that her PhD was on the significance of navigating relationship and the learning that we have from that. And when Bev is not writing, you can find her in a kayak. When the water freezes over, you can find her on snowshoes somewhere on the lake. And she does a lot of fabulous work within her community and is such a generous spirit and soul. So without further ado, let's jump in. I want you to tell us a little bit about your memoir, Bev.
Okay, I'm pleased to. So Dance into the Light it's a 7-year period, and I do dovetail into other times of my life, but it's mostly 7 years of when my youngest sister, by 11 years, went off the rails, frankly. She was laid off from a much loved position and she spiraled into alcoholism. And I think what happened there was I always suspected something was going on for my sister, and I'll call it now an undiagnosed mental health issue,
Yeah.
that it came to the top during this time of trial and devastation for her because her identity was really tied in with this job that she loves so much.
Yeah.
And at the same time as I was trying to rescue my sister from this darkness, which I knew a lot about because many of my students had gone down a similar kind of
Yeah.
road, and I always managed to bring them back to
Yeah.
a place where they could go off and live out their lives. I mean, I'm not saying I
Nice.
was 100% successful,
Yeah.
but at the same time, my husband was diagnosed by 4th-stage lung cancer.
Wow.
I thought I was going to lose him.
Yeah.
Just for the record, he is now a poster boy for immunotherapy. He's doing very well, and
Love that.
he's vibrant. I get to still have him in my life. Thank you, Lord. And my mom had just died, and in fact, 1 week after my mother's death, we learned about Jack's lung cancer.
Wow. That is a lot on
And
the plate.
it was a lot. And my dad, of course, being alone for the first time in his life and his ailing health, I helped him navigate his way into long-term care, and
Yeah.
that was not a pleasant story
That is
because
not a fun process.
no. So everything was kind of happening at the same time. And I know at this stage in our lives it happens for a lot of
Yeah.
us. But I decided I needed to write about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and tell us a little bit about that inspiration, because one of the things I loved about the book, and we could talk about it a little bit more later, but you don't even have to have a mental illness or a suicide in your family or with a loved one, because I found reading your memoir made me address a lot of my baggage, some of which I hadn't picked up to sort of look at and explore. And you've mentioned about addiction and mental health. We have long histories of that in our family, on both sides of the family, frankly. And I find we pay a lot of lip service now to have come so far in how we deal with it, but I find there's still so much stigma attached to it, and people, and shame and embarrassment, and people don't share. So I'd love if you could share what inspired you to tell this story in such a public way.
Yes, I wanted to jab at the stigma. And, so first of all, I was the one to have found my much loved sister. She took her life by hanging herself. I found her in my dad's house, and I felt like I was walking onto a movie set. I
Yeah.
didn't think I would ever live to see such a horrible sight and And so I went into therapy
Yeah,
because, frankly, I wasn't coping very well. I was having
of
horrible
course.
nightmares, and
Yeah,
it was getting in the way of living a fulsome life.
yeah.
And in the third or fourth session of working with this fabulous cognitive behavioral therapist, I looked over on her bookshelf and I saw a book that I had read a long time ago, and it was called The Unquiet Mind
Hmm.
by Kay Redmond Jameson.
Okay.
And I loved the book then, and I still love the book now. But that I said to her, I said, that book deepened my understanding about bipolar illness. And I need to write about my experience with my
Yeah,
sister.
yeah.
And she said, she's a trauma therapist at CAMH, Canadian Adult or
Hmm.
Canadian
Canadian
Association
mental
for
health.
Mental Health. And so she said, Bev, I hope you do because there are not enough stories written from the family perspective.
Yeah, yeah,
So with that encouragement, I moved forward, not right away. I needed a lot of healing to do. It
yeah,
took me probably 7 to 8 months before I really started getting
yeah.
into writing it. So for me, I wanted to give back something because I got such wonderful care. I knew where to look to go and get help, and maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah.
And that's the part of my story, not just only about stabbing at the stigma, because people who, we hear all these myths about people who take their lives. Oh, they took the
Yeah.
easy way out. And they're so
Yes.
selfish. And so I don't see it that way at all. My sister had an illness,
Yeah.
and it's not that she was a bad person. She was a person who was unwell.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get that story out.
I love it. And you did it so beautifully, and it is so needed. And I love you're just always so open and transparent about it. And which I believe is the only way we're ever going to start changing these patterns and change that stigma. And like you just so casually, talk about getting the therapy, which I love. And let's face it, I mean, most people do, at least enlightened people who want to live their best life do.
Yeah.
And yet so few people are willing to talk about it. They
Yeah.
carry their own internal stigma about it. So
Yeah.
you'd said about maybe we can talk about where to get help. Why don't we now while it's on the table? What are some
Okay.
suggestions you have for people who may be struggling or know someone who's struggling?
Well, I always kind of giggle about this because the therapist I ended up working with her name was Dr. Denisoff, and she's since retired. I always wear these people out. I work with them. She I heard about her from a friend's sister from Saskatoon, and her son had taken his life. And my friend hooked me up with his sister. We had a long, tearful
Yeah,
conversation. And at the end of the conversation, she said, I think I know someone who you can talk to.
yeah,
And within a week, I was in that woman's office and I worked with her for almost a year. And I was
yeah,
so distraught, Cindy. Now, this woman was down in a beautiful office down on University Avenue in
yeah,
Toronto, and she faced south. And it wasn't until nearing the end of my time with her when I walked into her office, and she was the head of the psychotherapy
yeah,
unit down there. And I said to her, "Oh man, do you ever have a wonderful view? How did I not see this?" And she said, "Because you were traumatized.
wow,
You couldn't." And so that gave me a real perspective of how
wow,
unwell I was. But so at the same time
yeah,
that I was working with her, I hooked up with, and this was through Victim Services. Victim Services is a free resource we have in Ontario.
yeah,
And the police, who were all stars, the first responders that
wow,
helped family and I were all stars. The fire, the the ambulance, the coroner, the six police people, all of the people that just came into my father's house
yeah,
after that 911 call were gracious and kind and subdued. And 2 days after my sister's life came to an end, I got a phone call from a woman from Victim Services who told me that the sergeant had passed along my case. And she really kind of normalized my feelings and
yeah,
said, "You've been through a trauma." She said, "People are going to try to stigmatize your trauma and your sister." And she told me what to expect.
yeah,
And
wow,
then she hooked me up with a service, Toronto Distress Center. And I ended up my husband was I mean, having a good partner through all of this is
yeah,
absolutely a godsend. And so my husband came with me to the very first drop-in session where there were 6 other people sitting in a circle, and they had all lost a loved one as well. It was the hottest September night it could possibly have been. It was down behind the Eaton Centre in Toronto
Yeah.
in that old house that sits in Trinity
Oh,
Square.
Trinity, I love that place. It's
Yeah.
gorgeous. Yeah.
And we went up these rickety stairs, and I remember the guy trying to open the window of this old house, and I'm thinking,
Yeah.
"Please, God, I hope it opens," because there was, that stale kind of
Yes.
mildewy air that happens
Yeah.
in old houses. Well, that's where we were at. We
Yeah.
forgot all that because we all started to share our stories.
Yeah.
And this wonderful man named Alex, he was also a suicide loss survivor and then trained in the work and wonderful social worker person. And he hooked me up with 2 people who I met with for 8 weeks in a lovely Victoria home
Yeah.
fireplace, but it could have been anywhere.
Yeah.
And they took me through this curriculum, and they were every week, which I looked forward to so much. 8 weeks, 1 hour with them. I could cry and laugh, and they took me through the process of understanding death by suicide and that it was different to
Mm.
deal with. And like, I'd already lost my mom and,
Yeah.
several friends and dogs
Yeah.
and cats. But this was a different kind of grief because
Yeah.
in those other kinds of grief, you aren't dealing with coroners and police
Yeah.
and second guessing the person who died or wondering why they did it or
Yeah.
couldn't do it. So I can't recommend that process strongly enough. And I hope that every community has a distress center like that because they really got me through a difficult time.
Yeah. And for our listeners out there, I'd say as well, we'll try and put some resources in the show notes. And if
Yes,
it doesn't attach to your area, please feel free to reach out and we can help hook you
yes,
up with something locally. Because one of the themes I want to really put a pin in, Bev, for our listeners there that you said, sort of weaving through those beautiful stories you were sharing about some of the resources you had, almost all of them started because you were open, right? That sort of word of mouth and connection and your openness to sort of receiving that support. And that support being the second theme that I'm really hearing as well. Like, I think we often have a tendency to turtle and sort of delve, particularly because of stigma and the shame and the embarrassment. And in fact, the opposite is the thing that is going to be the light to get you through that tunnel. And I also wanted to spin back because we kind of glossed over, but for our listeners, if you didn't catch that, Bev had been going for months, almost a year, and then suddenly noticed this spectacular view. And if you're dealing with somebody in your life who's struggling, it's easy to have the tendency to go, oh, just suck it up. There's so much beauty out there. And, with all of our mindset about positivity, some people are calling it toxic positivity now. It puts a lot of pressure on somebody who's not in a space to even see or appreciate it. What are your thoughts on that, Bev?
Oh, I mean, it's, you nailed it. I think there were a lot of things I couldn't see, and that one was kind of like a metaphor. But
Yeah.
back to your point about not of being open to the help.
Yeah.
I write a chapter in the book about a young man that I worked with in my youth, and his father suicided. And in the time that I worked with him, his anger just got in the way of everything. And in my work, I was able to get through the anger. In fact, I wasn't really angry at my sister because I understood it as an illness.
Yeah.
And just for the record, I never felt any guilt.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I did not feel guilt. I know within the cycles of accepting death
Yeah.
and death and dying, we talk about guilt. I felt that I had done everything humanly possible
Yeah.
to help my sister get through that dark time,
Yeah.
and I had to accept her choice.
Yeah. Wow, that's a
Sad
beautiful
choice.
perspective. I know, I love that. Because and you rarely hear that perspective because gosh, we are so good on piling guilt on ourselves. And I wanted to circle back for a sec because you also I love that you gave tribute to sort of the first responders because they could take a lot of heat, sometimes deserved, but certainly I must say it's been a long time since I thought about that, Bev, when our son had a pretty quite serious episode about 4 years ago now when he first got diagnosed. There were 2 police officers who attended the scene. One was the sort of negative stereotype you would expect, who showed just such an utter lack of sensitivity or
Yeah.
appreciation and was luckily had the good grace to step back. But his partner, oh my gosh, Constable Matt McBride, I will be forever grateful. He
Yeah.
spent hours with me negotiating and spelling off for each other with my
Yeah.
son, and he was remarkable and sensitive, and what a difference that can make. So, now this had to be a really difficult story for you to write. I'm sure that's pretty gross understatement, but how did you negotiate with yourself to sort of push through those hard parts?
Oh, yeah, there were two hardest chapters was writing about my sister, finding my sister. And the other hardest part
Oh, okay.
chapter was writing about telling my father.
Mm,
So, and I did not write the story in order. I
yeah,
wrote it all over the place, and I wrote those hard chapters when I was ready.
yeah.
And so
Right.
and so when I did write the chapter about having walked into the house and meeting Jacqueline's dog at the door, and then finding what I her no longer alive, I wrote it, and I was working with another therapist by this time. The one I talked to you about earlier
Yeah.
had already retired, but she'd left me a name of someone who she thought I would get along with, and she was bang on. She was also trained in narrative, how I'm trained in
Okay.
narrative
Yeah.
writing. She was trained in narrative therapy. We spoke the same language, very important when you're picking
Yeah.
therapists. I phoned her up and I told her that I'd been referred, that about I'd lost a sister to suicide and I'm a suicide loss survivor. I think I'm okay, I said, but I want to write about this, but not without a sage on the side, just in case something comes up.
Yeah. Yeah.
She thought that was a wise idea. She'd worked with other memoirists before.
Yeah.
And I met with her every week, and we didn't talk so much about the memoir. We talked about life. We talked about how to negotiate with someone who has alcoholism.
Yeah.
It's like dealing not with one person, you're really
Yeah.
kind of dealing with two people.
Yeah.
So that was one thing I did, that I had the fortunate situation of dealing with that. But I
Yeah.
also watched who I shared my writing with, and I approach this writing differently than when I write fiction. Like with
Yeah.
fiction writing, I kind of share it with everybody.
Yeah.
But this story, I didn't share it with the Muskoka Author Association writers who I love so much. I just
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
stayed underneath the radar because I really needed to make up my own mind. Us
Yeah.
writers sometimes like to influence each other a little bit. I just wanted to be really clear about all of that. But I went back to my writing partner from when I was at OISE, also a narrative researcher person. She was writing a memoir,
Yeah.
and we met biweekly, and we dug into each other's past in a really kind, loving way.
That's
So
beautiful.
picking the right person to talk to. I mean, that's with anything,
Yeah.
you're stressed out or you're
Yeah.
suffering from a depressive, going through
Yeah.
some depression. Talk to the right people.
Yeah.
Don't talk to the bullies. Talk to the people who are going to really hold you in your pain
Yeah.
and not baby you, but help you through.
Oh, that's beautiful advice. And I'm glad you mentioned that about the therapist and that finding the right fit, because I think so often people will go, not all therapists are created equal. And it's,
No.
and even of the ones who are really skilled, not every therapist is going to resonate or connect with you in a way that works. And I think people often go, they find somebody who's either not up to the task or just isn't a great fit for them, and then they give up on it all. So I love that you called that out. Thank you for that. I think that's so important. And now you had mentioned about the fact that the therapist also talked to you about negotiating, in addition to helping you sort of negotiate through your own sort of place to be able to write those difficult parts, but also negotiating with a loved one who's suffering from addictions and or mental health issues, because it's tough. I know from personal experience. So I'd love if you can share your negotiation experience with your sister. How did you do it? How did it affect your relationship with her?
Well, I probably broke every rule in the book when I was when I was trying to save my sister's life, but I never stopped loving her. I reminded myself, I always knew that alcoholism was a mental was a
Yeah.
is an illness. It didn't mean she was a bad person. I
Yeah.
tried to leave my judgment at the door.
Yeah.
Did she make me angry sometimes with her behavior? Absolutely. But I picked the times when I was going to pick up the phone and try to talk to her. Oftentimes she said, "No, get lost. I don't want to
Yeah.
talk to you. You don't know what you're talking about." And this is something I would talk to the therapist about.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just to be reminded you don't go through this stuff alone. It's not a good idea, but just to be reminded that there's so much space when you're dealing with someone with a mental health issue or alcoholism or other kinds of
Yeah.
addictions, so much space to second guess yourself.
Yeah.
And I was doing a lot of that. And so I was talking to people. I actually went to Al Anon meetings for a little while
Yeah.
just to hear the voices of people who were more experienced in this business than I
Smart.
was. Yeah. So
Yeah.
just, I think the work in the therapy was, I mean, one thing she said to me when I was talking to her about Jacqueline, she said, "You're not just dealing with one person here, you're dealing with two people, and it's complicated."
Yeah.
So she encouraged me to stay away as much as I could.
Yeah.
As I said, I didn't do too well with that because I had a second mother syndrome with my
Yeah.
sister. Now, I know you're a mother, Cindy, so you know
Oh,
exactly.
I'm guilty. That's why I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because what you're saying is resonating very deeply
Yeah.
with me, Bev.
Yeah, and the word I like to use, and I used it a couple of times in my books, it's called splagosynomia. It's that love it's a Greek word, and it's that kind of love it's in your pores, it's in
Oh,
your every organ of your body, and the love is deep, deep,
yeah.
deep. So when you have that, and someone that you care about that way is hurting themselves,
Yeah.
it's very hard to stay away. So I reached into therapy to help me with that as well.
So smart. I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. And it's funny as you were saying it when you'd said about choosing your when, because what one of the models that like, and I have to remind myself all the time, because otherwise you get triggered, right? And it's easy because you care so much. It's easy to get super reactive. So, I call it the 5 W's. And quickly I do that mental checklist, like who do I want to show up as? Who are they expecting to like do all the who's, right?
Yeah.
Who are they likely to show up as? Who, what, where, when, and why. And I choose that when with intention, right? Don't engage in the conversation when you know you're in a pissy mood or going to be really triggered or when they are, right? And so I love that it sounds like you were just intuitively very strategic about that as well. And what would you say you learned from those negotiating experiences, if anything?
Well, I have to trust myself. And you use the word intuition, and I've always worked at trusting my intuition.
Yeah.
And when I don't listen to my intuition, I usually suffer.
Yeah.
And so really, and giving myself some credit. And
Yeah.
I've been around the block, so I did bring some experience to this because of the students that I worked with and good friends, who
Yeah.
drink too much and get into trouble.
Yeah.
So not doing it alone.
Yeah.
And I did walk down that road. In fact, I got quite manipulative with my own husband, who loves me very much. I knew Jacqueline was in her house drinking like a crazy person. And,
Yeah.
I shouldn't frame it that way, but
Right.
in a way that was
Yeah.
concerning me. And
Yeah.
she was with a man who I didn't know.
Yeah.
And the curtains were all drawn, and she wasn't answering her phone, and I sat outside of her house
Yeah.
for hours
Yeah.
just in case
Yeah.
something happened. If she came flying through the door and she needed me, her big sister was going to be
Oh,
there. Then
wow.
I had a wake up call because I felt kind of creepy. I
Yeah.
was sitting. I was sitting in my car underneath a lamppost. I was waiting for a neighbor to knock on the window, which would have sent me to orbit. And so I thought, Beverly, go home. Go home, and I never did it again. So
Yeah.
I paid attention to my own behaviors,
Yeah.
and I give myself a break. I can laugh about it now, but
Yeah.
my sister would have had a fit if she knew I was
Oh,
outside
yeah. Yeah.
stalking her like that.
But what was that Greek word again? That really resonated.
Phagoshinomia.
I'm gonna have to I've never heard that before, so I'm definitely learning stuff here
Yeah.
today. That's fabulous. And how do you feel that your sister's suicide shaped you?
I think I've come to a deeper understanding of acceptance, and I have to say it took me a long time to accept that my sister had something going on, like a mental health issue.
Yeah.
I didn't know her that way. It's quite blinded by
Yeah.
my love, and we used to tiptoe around Jacqueline since probably her adolescence, and it was never named.
Yeah.
So an undiagnosed mental health issue.
Yeah.
And I knew, I used to have several glasses of wine with my sister. I never thought of her as
Yeah.
being a problem drinker and then ultimately an alcoholic. So accepting that about her struggles was very, very hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had a lot of people around me saying, "Bev, you gotta leave, gotta let her go. You gotta let her go. Let her hit bottom." Well, in my
Yeah.
mind, she'd already hit bottom.
Yes. Oh,
She'd picked out the worst guy she could
yeah.
possibly be with. She'd lost her house, she'd lost her job,
Yeah.
she'd lost her dog, she lost everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Oh,
so, I think you asked me what I learned. I think because I have another very important person in my life who drinks too much, and I'm different.
okay.
I'm able to step away,
Yeah.
and I put it away. I journal. I'm a chronic journal person. I journal a lot. I put it on the page and make it the page's problem
Yeah. I
till the
like that.
morning.
I like
Yeah,
that. Because it's
yeah,
hard to step away. I mean, and again, for our listeners out there, if you're at the stage where you're not able to distance yourself, give yourself some grace and space. You are not
yeah,
alone. You're not alone. And Bev, one of the things that strikes me, like when you were saying at the beginning about, and I had forgot, frankly, about just how much you had on your plate at that time. And when we talk about grief, I think most people only think about grief in the context of death. But
yeah.
yeah, I believe at least, like there's a like with your sister dealing with the
Oh,
mental health. There's a grieving for someone that you love who is struggling with mental health. There's a grieving for someone that you love who's struggling with addictions issues. There's a grieving for the fear around your husband and what that held for, the potential was. Then the grieving over your mother's death. And ultimately, I think the grieving for suicide, as you say, has a different qualitative nature to it because there's the violence and the intentionality around it that I think takes us to a different place. So
yes,
what
definitely.
what what lessons would you have for us? What, if anything, have you learned, would you say, about sort of negotiating grief?
Well, you're so right around that. I mean, it's not just about the final goodbye that someone takes. I grieved the loss of my sister and I were good friends. We were confidants. She was my running partner for a while. She taught me about weightlifting. I learned a lot from my sister who was 11 years younger than me, and I really expected to have a future with her
Yeah.
you know so it's not just, and my husband, I mean, my husband is doing very well with his recovery with cancer, but he's very hard of hearing.
Yeah.
I miss the conversations
Yeah.
that we used to have, so there's a loss there. So grief it's in our lives on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I think as we grow older, as a teacher, I had 36 years of teaching, and there were certain semesters when I just loved my students.
Yeah.
And those would be the students I would invite to my home, and we'd have a
Oh,
party
nice.
in my backyard. And I found at the end of the year, at the end of those kinds of semesters, not
Yeah.
all of them, but those kinds of semesters, I really grieved that
Yeah.
experience and some of those personalities.
Yeah.
And so I think consequently, I grieving is something that I do. My mother tried to hide death from me when I was a kid,
Hmm.
and because she thought she was protecting me.
Yeah.
And I'm not, throwing her under the bus or
Yeah.
anything, but I'm just saying that she had made a mistake.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I always say kids should have a goldfish or a dog or a cat so they can have the whole life of the
Yeah.
dog, a cat, the pet, and also learn how to say goodbye.
Yeah. Oh boy, you've hit a raw nerve with me there because it's so true. I like it, full transparent. If I had it to do over again with our kids, as you know, we had 3 kids in 3 years and kind of made up for lost time. But we try to insulate our kids from any sorts of failure in life and from
Mhm.
experience those negative, and we do such a disservice. Oh my gosh, such a disservice when we do that. And I love that you mentioned about the grieving, even missing your students, because we have such narrow views about it, and then we don't actually deal with our grieving. And I know even when my son got diagnosed, there was a grieving about the loss of the expectations I had for what his life would look like, frankly. Even that was a grieving process, right? So I think recognizing those different kinds of grieving and allowing ourselves to take care of ourselves, like in the ways that you suggest, like, get therapy, have support people around you, look for those resources, make sure you get downtime doing things that nourish you and fill you up. What was something you found really surprising, Bev, about writing, or was there something in the process of writing that really surprised you when you were writing this memoir?
Well, there were a few surprises. Like I mentioned earlier, I guess I had never named the tiptoeing that we did around my
Yeah,
sister. You know, she was so beautiful and so articulate and so funny sometimes
yeah,
that it was really, she did get a pass on a few things. So
yeah,
I'd never expressed that before until I started writing about it. And I think I came to a new understanding about my mom. Poor old
yeah,
mom. I used to, my mother and I weren't always good together.
yeah,
And and sometimes the tension that was living out between us was because of Jacqueline. I told you I
yeah,
wanted to be Jacqueline's second mother. Sometimes I would
yeah.
have even have liked to been in first base. But she and my mother, my mom pushed back on that.
Yeah,
And she was a little more protective of Jacqueline than I was.
yeah,
And I would have stepped up,
yeah,
quicker. But I think as a result of writing the memoir, I came to terms with my mom knew more than I thought she knew.
yeah,
And
yes,
if she were here today, I'd say, Mom, I'm sorry. But I'm sorry. And so you don't always know what you think you know.
yeah. Oh,
And this is the good thing about having an honest writing partner who would say, Bev, how do you know that? Like if I'd said, my mom could be pretty nasty sometimes.
yeah,
She'd say, Bev, unpack that.
yeah,
What was
nice.
going on?
Yeah,
And that came out in the writing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Writing's a miraculous thing, isn't it, Bev? I mean, and I'm glad you're suggesting for our listeners about that journaling as well. Can be
Yeah.
even if you don't consider yourself a writer, you don't have to share it out there. But I find there is something not only cathartic about getting it out, but
Yeah.
like you, there are times when I started writing stuff and wow, I got insights about my feelings towards important people in my life that I was not at all conscious about. And it's funny you say the mom. I remember writing a piece about my mom once and then the first person who read it was like, "Wow, you hold so much resentment." And I was like, "What? What do you do?" And then I unpacked it and it was like, "Oh my God, this is loaded with resentments that I never allowed myself the space to deal with." So
Yeah.
therapeutic. Now,
Yeah.
speaking about writing about like when we're writing about other people, particularly for such an honest and rich story as your memoir is, it can raise issues about consent. How did you end up negotiating, if you will, the stories that you told about other people when it came to that consent piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, my publisher said to me once he read the draft and the edits were done and everything, he said, "Okay, before we go anywhere with this, there are two people I want to get letters from."
Uh,
He says, "Because I don't want to get sued."
yeah.
And the one person was my sister Mel, who is
Okay.
5 years younger, the middle child,
Yeah.
5 years younger than myself. And the other person was Jacqueline's first husband.
Okay.
So what I did, the very first person I spoke to about writing my memoir was my father.
Yeah.
And I was sitting at his bedside in the nursing home, and I told him I was going to wanted to write this, and he thought it was an excellent
Oh,
idea. I
good.
think intuitively he knew it was good for me,
Yeah.
and because he just accepted Jacqueline's choice. He was very, very sad, but
Yeah.
and he was angry with my sister, and he got through it, but he knew that I was struggling
Yeah.
with it. So I got permission from him right off the bat,
Yeah.
and that was very important to me. I wrote the memoir with everybody's names in it first
Yeah.
because I didn't want to get people mixed
Yeah.
up. And then I went back and I changed the names of people. I spoke to a very good friend of Jacqueline's who had the kind of job where she has to be careful about her own
Yeah.
confidentiality. She's in the field of corrections. And I was a little bit concerned about her.
Mhm.
And my decision would have been that I would have to take her out of the story.
Yeah.
You don't want to do that with memoir because
Yeah.
memoir is all about integrity and
Yeah.
it's the whole story. I mean, but you also don't include a person's story in there if it's going to hurt them.
Yeah.
There was a man in the book who that I was very regretful that Jacqueline was tied up with him. I think she met him online somewhere and she wasn't very discerning and she hooked him with this fella. and his family. I did not speak to him.
Yeah.
I changed his name and his and the and I didn't make him. I made him unrecognizable,
Yeah.
and but I wrote about him with great compassion.
Yeah. You did.
And he was an unwell person as well.
Yeah.
So I really took care of every person that I didn't name. I neighbors and I told neighbors, everybody who's in the book has is got a fictionalized name. That's the
Yeah.
only thing that's fictionalized about them. But
Yeah.
I felt really good about how I handled it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
compassion is the perfect word, Bev, I must say, like having read it. I mean, not only is it compelling and poignant, obviously, as a memoir, and this very heart-centered kind of exploration about,
Mm,
our humanity, really, the human condition, but it's so raw and real. But as I say, it really, I think, for me at least, it forces, I think, the reader to confront their own inner demons, right? And come to better terms with how to handle loss and things in our life. I think it's
yeah.
now, what role would you say emotion played in the negotiations? I mean, this is a very close, heartfelt relationship, so I'm sure emotion was a big factor.
Geez, that's an interesting question. I think, well, when I gave it to my middle sister, Mel, to read, she read it very, very quickly. And I think I mean, I don't want to put an emotion on her, but I suspect that she was a bit concerned how she would come across in the book
Course.
because she was in a different place than I
Yeah,
was and not quite as close to Jacqueline. And if they were close, they were more combative.
yeah.
But that was all part of the illness. When she read it, she liked the way I handled her part of the story,
Oh, nice.
and she expressed great relief.
Yeah,
And I said, "Well, what did you think I was going to do?" And she made a mention about not being in the story as much as I was. And I said, "Yes, but it wasn't your story.
yeah,
And I wasn't writing from your perspective.
yeah,
Plus, she had a handful. She had a difficult husband in her life, so she
yeah,
got a pass too. I mean,
yeah,
she had I was I'm very fortunate in terms of I have a very compassionate life partner
yeah,
who supported me all the way in this. So she was relieved of any worry that she might not look
yeah.
good.
Nice.
Yeah. I can't
Yeah,
really say how other people might now. I will say if my mom was alive when I wrote the book,
yeah.
I would have had to have had a very different kind of conversation with her
Yes. Yeah.
because she was the kind of person that Gladys on The Bewitched,
Yeah.
who
Oh
would
gosh. Yeah.
she knew she was worried about other people on the
Oh,
street
that's so
like a
funny.
like a Gladys, and she wouldn't. And I would have. I'm not sure what I would have done. I
Yeah.
don't know if I could have written a story.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how at different times and places with different
Yeah.
people, I've often, I'm a totally tangent here, but I've often said, I think he takes offense, but like my dad died young at only 52 years old of an unexpected heart attack. And I don't think I'd be with my husband today had my dad been alive because I
Mm,
was different. His judgment impacted how I showed up. And Don was very different than the typical kind of guy who I dated. And he was very empathetic and compassionate in ways. And my dad would have really busted his chops and that would have made me look at him differently. It was so
yeah.
it's
That
interesting
that
how that happens.
that's
And
wow. That's could be an interesting paper.
yes, yes, actually, I don't think I've ever written about that. There you go. I should probably be doing that to unpack some of my own stuff, frankly. So,
Yeah.
but empathy is a word that really jumps out, Bev. I mean, one thing I think, you talked about your treatment of your sister and the gentleman that Jacqueline was hooked up with who you didn't like. And you seem to always be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and show up with this very empathetic approach, which I think is just so
Yeah.
important and so missing from our dialogue in today's polarized
Yeah.
world. So it's just,
Yeah. Jacqueline lost her empathy.
yeah,
And that's when I knew she was unwell.
yeah,
I think, if a person doesn't have empathy, any
mm,
empathy, I
yeah,
mean, we can all have our moments, right? When
yes,
we
yeah, yeah,
sure. But no, I think empathy is something. I mean, I'm glad I have empathy.
yeah,
It helps me understand other people
yeah,
because, frankly, s- life gets difficult
yeah,
and you have to put yourself in
yeah,
that person's shoes. And I think that point of view, and us writers, we're good at that because
yeah,
we have to do that all the time with our
Yeah.
characters. But in real life, it's a very important
Yeah.
tool.
But you get better outcomes, right? I mean, when you show up from
Yeah,
a place that if you're not able to muster that empathy for somebody else and what they may be
yeah.
going through in their life, we show up with a very hitting them right on kind of approach that just never gets best outcomes, right? So, anyhow, no, do you
Mm.
have any non-negotiable habits, would you say, that you're sort of committed to either before or because of what you went through?
Yes. Well, I do write every day.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I live on a lake, as you do, and I look out the window every day, and
Yeah.
I have such gratitude for living here and having to look through the trees to see the
Yeah.
water and hear the birds. But in terms of what I came away with from writing the memoir and Jacqueline taking her life, and I think I'm more acutely aware of living each day to the best of my ability.
Mm.
And I can't tell you how much gratitude I have that my last conversation with my sister was a good one.
Oh,
We like, I never wanted to there was one time in our relationship when I said to her, "You know, I'm gonna have to cut you off because I can't be with you anymore and you're driving me crazy." And I didn't last more than, 2 days on that.
yeah.
But our our last conversation was when my dad was in the nursing home, and I thought I had made a mistake. And I phoned her up and I said to her, I talked to her about it. I said,
Yeah.
I don't think that's the right place for dad. The room's too small and it's dark and it's this and he's that and his roommate and diddle diddle diddle. And she spoke to me with such wisdom
Huh.
and heard me.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she was always a little more straightforward than I am. And she said, you know what? That doesn't matter to dad,
Yeah.
and but she was right.
Yeah.
It didn't, and I'm so grateful that I was still turning to my youngest sister, even in her time of distress,
Yeah.
that she was still okay in my mind and in my heart.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
beautiful. And oh gosh, that really gave me chills as you said that, because I think, we're going through an issue with my son again right now. And I see the way the world interacts with people when there are mental health issues or addictions issues, and people tend to completely discount the input that they have and assume that they're not going to be believed, for example, and things.
yeah,
And my gosh, sometimes they bring the most incredible and things that we would think are incredible achievements or thoughts that come from somebody else, we immediately discount when it comes from somebody who has mental health or
yeah,
addictions issues. So
yeah.
I love that you were able to see that in her. And Val, I can't believe how quick our time has gone here together. We're going to have to do a follow up to this because you've just shared such incredible insights. And thank you so much for your beautiful transparency. I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life? Again, it can be doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about. Just one of those moments when you're like have that aha and see things differently, show up differently because of it.
I think it's a big one for me. I have to accept that someone like my sister made the choice that she was in so much pain
Yeah.
that there was no other choice for her. So she had the right to make that choice.
Yeah.
And that that works every day of our lives. When
Yeah.
people are deciding on things, we have to take pause and again empathize, put ourselves in
Yeah.
their shoes. So yeah.
Oh,
Sorry,
well,
sorry I'm ending on such a serious note, but
no, they say things come to you when you need it. And I feel like you were speaking directly to me in that moment because I'm having an issue with my son right now. And when you said that, I'm imposing what I want for him and trying to impose what I want for him and layer it on as opposed to respecting his choices. They're his to make, whether it's the direction I'd like to see him go. And I'm sure for all our listeners there as well, I really invite you to take that deep in your heart a little bit, and hopefully it'll give you a little shiver like it did with me. Is there somebody in your life right now who are making choices that you're finding hard to accept? that maybe you could step away from and allow them the space and grace to make those choices, even if they're mistakes. I think that was a beautiful
Not too
insight.
far away, just a little bit away.
Yes, yes, good call. So where can people learn more about you, Bev? Where can they get your book and what's next on the agenda
Oh,
for
I
you?
would love if people would visit my website. It's beverley-brewer.ca. And I have a blog. I write every second week in the blog. So if people were to go on there and write a comment and engage. But this is a book. This is my book.
Oh,
And
gorgeous cover, by the way.
it's the work. Thank you. I love this cover. And this could be myself or Jacqueline.
Oh, it looks like you. I thought it was you when I first saw the
Yeah,
cover. So
yeah, yeah. It's just So yes, my book is available on Amazon and in shops through Muskoka. There's a bookstore in Aurelia called Mentador. There's another one up in Huntsville called the Red Canoe, I think.
yeah, I always
And
get it wrong.
yeah, I get it wrong, but it's up there. There's only one. We
Yeah,
don't have enough bookstores, so
yeah.
it won't be hard to find. So
Yeah.
if you happen to meet me somewhere, there's always a box in my trunk.
I love that. And for our listeners, again, check again. The title of the book is Dance into the Light. And I'm a big supporter, as is Bev, of independent bookstores. So go ask at your local independent bookstore. If they don't have it, ask them to bring it in.
Yeah.
But if you're an Amazon person, you can definitely get it there. And also make sure to leave a review. I think it's an important subject. It's one we want more people to know about and to read about. And that actually happens as more and more people leave reviews. It helps get more visibility. So check that out and check out Bev's website at, did you say it's beverley-brewer.ca?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's
And we'll make
L-E-Y.
and we'll make
Beverly.
sure to put that in the show notes as well, so you can check that
Okay.
out and check out those ongoing blog posts. And again, thank you, Bev, so much. You have just shared so many powerful and valuable lessons that came from your heart, but I think are great life lessons for anybody who is listening to this. So thanks for joining and sharing.
It was a pleasure to spend time with you, Cindy, as
Yes.
usual.
And for our listeners, make sure to give feedback and give the gift of sharing. Share this episode. As I say, we all suffer losses of various kinds in our life or deal with people in our lives who are going through challenges. Maybe you're going through challenges yourself in your life right now. So share this episode, share the book. Make sure we start talking about these issues more, a little more openly, a little more transparently, so that we can start shifting some of the shame and blame and stigma around these issues. So I know I got tons of value from this episode. I have no doubt you did as well. Make sure to subscribe before, if you haven't done that already. And before we sign off, just want to quickly share some ways we can work together. If you are looking to negotiate your best life, because all of life is a negotiation, I've got everything from online to group to my signature mastermind or VIP experiences to help you leverage your innate power so you can get more of what you want and deserve in life, live that fullest life. If that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. Make sure to grab a copy of my book, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, if you haven't done that yet. And that is a wrap for this episode. Until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.